Today we're talking with Gustavo Guerra Vasquez. He's a Guatemalan raised in Los Angeles, California. He's a poet and he has a consulting organization for businesses. I want to thank Gustavo for being with us today. And I know that he wants to start by sharing one of his poems. So thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you, Alejandra. So I usually do this poem where I haven't read before, so it's kind of like an introduction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about my name. So Gustavo Adolfo, two names, no hyphen. Guerra Vasquez, two last names, no hyphen. I don't ascribe to the notion of a hyphen because while a hyphen is sometimes used to join, it can also be used to say get back and stay back. I am a Guatemalan Angelino, no hyphen. Because after crossing a hyphen on Mother Earth, this Guatemalan began a process of Californization, Pico Union style. And while resisting becoming another lost soul in Los Angeles, I migrated north once more, but only found the golden gate that wasn't meant for me. Or was it just an entrance to a gilded cage? Still searching for America, I went back to Guatemala, which back then was Guatepeor, only to find the bloodthirsty dictators running the show. So I went next door looking for salvation to El Salvador, only to find the bloodthirsty compadres also running the show. I have been to the depths of Honduras and the head of the continent, in which Chile is called ají, and found a few from Central America who were looking just like me. And so you see me here tonight on top of this whole hyphen that I'm always trying to erase, seeking as a human to improve all my relations in every single place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I feel like by sharing the poem we can know like your story, migration, and like going to other countries. So thank you so much. And I feel like you did share within the poem. We understand about how it was growing up in Guatemala and like your migration here. But if you can share just a little bit of how was your experience growing up in Guatemala and moving to the United States.
Sure. So I was born in Guatemala in 1973, and my nuclear family, lived together up until 1981, which is when my father migrated to the United States without papers. He did that because my mother arranged for it. Then she followed soon after that. And so I had a very good life in terms of my extended family. I had cousins, aunts, uncles who were really close to me, who I consider to be, basically like brothers and sisters. But my parents didn't see a future for themselves there. And my mother decided that we were going to move. And so she helped my father come here first. Then she came after him, both of them without papers. And then in 1982, at the age of 8, I came with a coyota. Basically, my mother paid a lady to bring me here without documents. So it was a big shock to have my parents leave. And in some ways, I kind of had to fend for myself because my grandmother was not the most caring person. And, I was glad when my mother sent for me. So you asked me, that's what it was like living in Guatemala. I don't know if you wanted me to add something else.
Oh no. That's fine. Yeah, because I was gonna ask you, like, when you said that you were born in 1973. So like the first thing that comes to my mind is that you were over there during all the war period. And as someone who, like, I was born in 1997. Like for me, that is on like the history books, But for you, that was real life, Like I don't know how was the experience. I know that in the cases of Guatemala and Salvador, some areas were more affected than others, but it was still under the same, type of government type of atrocities.
Hmm.
So how when moving here, and of course, like now you're here with your parents, and maybe if the if how you explain how your mom, like grandma, maybe not be the most caring, but I feel that once you come here, now you have like the type of your family. So how was that reunion of coming here after living during those years, because I can only imagine, and coming here and living with your parents.
Well, so let me back up and go into like what it was like growing up over there
Mm-hmm.
under the regimes that they had, right? So I was a
Mm-hmm.
little kid, so I didn't see a lot
Yeah.
of the stuff, but I would hear stuff. My aunt used to work for the court system, and she was placed in the Quiche region.
Mm-hmm.
And my family would talk about how la situación, that's kind of the way that people use the euphemism, right?
Mm-hmm.
La situación was not very good in El Quiche, and so they would worry about her. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the other, on the other, that's on my father's side. And then on my mother's side of the family, um, I had an uncle who was a union organizer. He was a courier for
Mm-hmm.
the banks. So I would
Mm-hmm.
hear my grandmother and my mother talk about el sindicato as if it was a bad thing, like very hush hush, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my mother, my father, and I came for economic reasons,
Mm-hmm.
but my uncle soon followed because he was threatened. Literally, people called him and said that they were going to kill him if he didn't stop doing what he was doing. So he
Mm-hmm.
followed us and came to LA at first. Then he moved to Houston and
Mm-hmm.
all that. But so the war, I think in Guatemala, for a little kid, right, like me,
Mm-hmm.
because I was in the capital, it didn't feel as present as it felt
Mm-hmm.
for the Maya communities that were basically undergoing genocide, right?
Mm-hmm.
They literally had to leave and flee because they were going to get killed.
Mm-hmm.
But it was there, you know. On both sides
Mm-hmm.
of my family, I would hear about it. I didn't know much. You know, I grew up thinking sindicato was a bad word because of the way my mother and my grandmother would say it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's up until now that I'm talking about, you know, the way that my family
Mm-hmm.
kind of dealt with the war, right? Um, and then coming to LA, obviously, it was a good thing to be reunited with my parents because
Mm-hmm.
my nuclear family, well, the three of us, my brother
Mm-hmm.
stayed behind because he was too young. The lady would not bring him
Okay.
because he was 2 years old. And my mother
Mm-hmm.
suffered for that. She cried. She would
Mm-hmm.
cry. And I would tell her, you know, that my grandmother loved him and would take care of him. And it was kind of you know, a benevolent lie because my grandmother was
Mm-hmm.
abusive. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I would have to tell my mother that because she would suffer over his not being with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, I was glad to be with my parents again, but at the same time, I missed my cousins. We were pretty much the only family that we had here. So
Mm-hmm.
that was also very traumatic because all the cousins that were like brothers and sisters to me, all the aunts and uncles, I used to spend
Mm-hmm.
like weeks in my cousin's house because I was going
Mm-hmm.
to school near their house. And so, in a way, it was a real rupture of my extended family to be with
Mm-hmm.
my immediate family. And even within my immediate family, we weren't all together. Now, we
Yeah.
were very fortunate because my mother hustled and managed to get a sponsor. So, you know, we were able to get a green card relatively
Mm-hmm.
soon after I got here. And
Mm-hmm.
my brother and all three of us were reunited. But that family, you know, system with the extended
Mm-hmm.
family was not there. And you know, there were obviously great things about being here, but that was one of the
Mm-hmm.
drawbacks.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you touch on a very important point of like, we often talk about immediate family, like mom, dad, brother or sister, and what about like the extended family? And I think that I can relate with you about being so attached to my to cousins. Like my extended family is like I consider more close than extended,
Hmm.
especially more from my mom's side than my dad's side. From my dad's side is a little bit more complicated just because they're more here in the United States and I haven't grew up with them. But I have a cousin that is like my sister. So I I feel like, once and it's something that happens with migration. And I feel like when we talk about migration and about the family reunion, what about like those extended, like, you said cousins, uncles, tias, tios, and like how you tend to feel like, ¿cómo se llama? Como, like it's something is missing because now like the only connection that you have close here in the United States is your immediate family. Like your mom, your dad, or your brother, your sister. And now you are outside of the world and you're trying to make friends, but those friends are never going to be compared to what it is to have a cousin that has compared closer to a sister or brother. And I think that we when we talk about migration, we mostly focus on like the close family, and I mean that, yeah, this is important and it's nice to have that support. And like I said, your mom suffered, and like at one point you were not all together. Once your mom managed to have that your sponsorship and bring your brother with you, it's like, okay, now we're together. But at the same time, like you don't have that other type of support, what is like your cousin, your uncles, your tias. And so like bringing that connection of like, okay, you're missing that other side of your family while you while you were being here in the United States. How was your experience as a Central American? Because there's one thing of, like we all as an immigrant, there's one experience, and then like as a Central American immigrant, I feel like that's more of what is the experience to live here in the United States.
Yeah, so I'm part of that generation that came in the early '80s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of folks were coming because of the war, and I settled in. Well, I didn't settle. My parents settled in LA.
Mm-hmm.
We lived in Koreatown first, in a big apartment building that had Mexicans and Hondureños, Salvadoreños,
Mm-hmm.
Salvadoreñas, and Puerto Ricanas, and that's really when I became a lot more conscientious of nation, right? I mean, I knew
Mm-hmm.
in Guatemala, like for example, you learn about flags and nationality
Mm-hmm.
over there, but it was here in LA when I really learned about like nationalism and nation,
Mm-hmm.
um, and and then race, right? I mean, over
Mm-hmm.
there you learn about racism because we learn that
Yeah.
stuff when it comes to indigenous and black folks. But
Mm-hmm.
literally, I was at a school where you had Vietnamese refugees, you had
Mm-hmm.
Korean refugees, you had Mexican folks, you had. I mean, my first best friend was my Argentinian interpreter who was a classmate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then aside from him, there was like the Salvadoran girl that used to interpret for me, even though I was in
Mm-hmm.
ESL classes and all that. So I think that was when I really realized, what it means to come from a country, if we want to call it that,
Mm-hmm.
right? I remember my
Yeah.
mom told me, "Oh, le tengo un amigo que es de Cuba." I didn't know where the heck Cuba was. His parents were from Cuba, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then I have this other poem that talks about nationality and flags and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in middle school and high school that I learned about rivalries, some internal rivalries between like Salvadorans and Guatemalans, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's also the time when Mara Salvatrucha was starting out. It was barely getting
Mm-hmm.
going. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually published something about, the folks who were deported back to Central America. But, um, but yeah, that was when I learned about what it meant to be a Central American immigrant. And
Mm-hmm.
we also obviously came into spaces that had a lot of Mexican folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of resentment on the part of a lot of Central Americans because coming through Mexico, we
Mm-hmm.
suffered, like
Mm-hmm.
the immigration officer from El DF took my food money, and the lady who was bringing me didn't give me food for like till we got to Tijuana because she didn't have enough money to give us food,
Yeah.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
so in the ESL classes at Belmont High School, which is where a
Mm-hmm.
lot of folks were in school. By then, I wasn't in ESL, but I hear stories about how a lot of the students
Mm-hmm.
who came when they were older, who were teenagers, would basically start arguing with folks from Mexico because they felt resentment over the way they were treated on the
Mm-hmm.
way here, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and that's what it played out in terms of gangs and stuff like that. A lot of it had to do with
Mm-hmm.
discrimination, targeting of people because they were from another country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and some folks formed it for self protection and all that. So
Mhm.
I mean, we've had a lot of great allies. We've had a lot of great
Mhm.
folks who have helped us out along the way. But I think that the experience for Central Americans, at least the way that I lived it, was that that's when I learned about nationalism. And there
Mhm.
are times when we would actually like fist fight over a country. Um, yeah, so
Mhm.
so you know, it was also a time when you had some folks who weren't very supportive of us. We had a lot of folks who were very nice, a lot of Mexican, Chicano, Chicana folks who were very nice
Mhm.
to us. But then you also had some who were not very nice to us, and
Mhm.
that was part of the problem that we saw coming into LA.
Yeah, yeah, and like if what now when you said like once you come here, that's when you realize about nationality. I think I can understand you because like when I moved here, I was 14. I was 2011, and I mean I knew the quote unquote, like Latino, Latina, but like I have always identified as, Hondureña, right? Like that was my identification. Coming here and having to be under this category of like Latino, and like I never understood why it was so important to every single time I had to put it into like papers and stuff like that. And I thought when I got here that la rivalidad between Centroamericanos and Mexican was because of soccer. And I used to say that so many times. Like, oh, yeah, it's because, because of soccer. I'm a huge soccer fan. So I was like, oh, it's because of soccer. And I used to have an uncle was like my aunt's, boyfriend. He was Mexican, and the la rivalidad between him and I was just because of soccer, not because of nationality. But once you come here and realize how there's more deeper things, like you said, like people actually remember things that they went through in Mexico, or for example, like the way people just pick on you just because of your accent of certain words or certain foods. And it's like, okay, this type of like, rivalidad inside a classroom is more complex than what we can think about when we are in high school, because we're like 14, 15, and we just got here. We're trying to learn the language. We're trying to figure it out things in our own, because like there's no someone else gonna tell you, it's like, okay, you have to go this way, while having this rivalidades, right? And then like it, and then you're getting to know more nationalities, right?
Hmm.
And you get to one point of like, oh, okay, so everybody under this umbrella of being Latino and Latina and Latinx, um, we are completely different from each other, it's like, yeah, we're under this umbrella, but it's like our experience, like the experience of a South American is so different from a Mexican. It's like the from the Caribbean is so different from Central America. So when and it's like I came here to Wilmington, like I was telling you before recording, and Wilmington is like mostly like, oh, I was at like 80% Mexican. Like is the population here is like yeah, it's very like Mexican like side, and that was something that I was so completely new to me. Like because of course I have seen Mexican culture and like lost, all the things that they portray in like the media, but nothing of like coming to real contact and how different like the language, the way of of course experiences, but I think the main one for me was the language, because it's like, oh yeah, it's a Spanish, but it's like at one point it's not Spanish, like it's Spanish from certain countries that does not translate the same way. And for example, like I'm very open of like me coming to a classroom and I was with my friend saying, oh, maje, to another Central American, and I didn't know that for other people that was something bad, and there's words that I did like they will say to me, and that for me I thought it was bad, but I had to understand what their translation in their language was. So it's like this whole little thing of like, oh, like kind of like going back and forth, back and forth. It's like, okay, this word does not mean that, if someone calls you away, it's not an animal, it's actually like saying like, hey, dude, so it was like a completely, and I'm sure you had those instances. Like for me, like the most instance that I had was with languages.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think as a poet and as a student of literature, I paid a lot of attention to
Mm-hmm.
language. And,
Mm-hmm.
um, I mean, for me, we were assimilating. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the whole situation for us was about learning English and speaking as much English as possible, right? But then
Mm-hmm.
I took Spanish to Spanish speakers with a whole array of students from different countries, and I had a really great teacher at Belmont High School,
Mm-hmm.
who happened to not be Latina, and that's a whole other story. But
Mm-hmm.
I think when I got to UC Santa Cruz and I did my undergrad is when we really started to explore language and the importance of language.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because if you say babosadas to a Mexican person, that's like the lowest, right? Like you're insulting them.
Mm-hmm.
Like I might say like "Déjate
Mm-hmm.
babosadas," and it's like for me, it's
Mm-hmm.
like stop messing around. Like don't
Mm-hmm.
stop it.
Yeah.
And for them, it was like, oh my god, that's like the hardest thing to swallow.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, or if I say to somebody, oh, está lleno de babosadas, and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
and it even happens
Yeah.
among us. I mean, I
Yeah.
actually have learned some Salvadoranisms, and when I say
Mm-hmm.
them to people in Guate, they're like, "Oh no digas eso, esa es mala palabra," or
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying in terms of the language. In 1999 or something like that, I was at a
Mm-hmm.
conference, and
Mm-hmm.
we managed to go from Arizona. It was the first Central American Culture and Literature Conference in the United States that we know of. And it
Mm-hmm.
was a group of us. I rented a car and we went to the Grand Canyon. So the funny
Mm-hmm.
thing about it was that in that car was myself, a graduate student who was Salvadoreña,
Mm-hmm.
who's who had grown up in El Salvador, a
Mm-hmm.
South American graduate student. They were both from Maryland, um, and an historian from El Salvador. And we're in a
Mm-hmm.
car, right? And we're driving to the Grand Canyon. So that was
Mm-hmm.
like my moment. And I said to Carlos is the historian. So I'm like, Carlos Cañas Dinarte, that's his full name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, Carlos, so where does this rivalry between Mexicans and Central Americans come from, right?
Mm-hmm.
I said, is it a product of, like the independence or is it from the 80s? Like, what's the deal? And
Mm-hmm.
he's like, it's both. He said it's both from people crossing through and, the way that folks got treated on the way north and also, left over from independence and what happened
Mm-hmm.
after Mexican independence, right? If we want to call it independence, but that's a whole other
Mm-hmm.
story. The
Mm-hmm.
funny thing about it is that Nilda, the Salvadoran graduate student who had grown up in El Salvador, says to both of us, I always thought that the rivalry was between Chapines and Guanacos. And that was like a
Ugh.
really kind of like a moment where I was like, it really depends
Mm-hmm.
on where you are. It really
Mm-hmm.
depends on where you're coming from and your life
Mm-hmm.
experience. Um,
Yeah.
and so that was eye opening for me because it was like, oh, we it's George Lipsitz, a professor
Mm-hmm.
who is just retiring out of Santa Barbara in ethnic studies, talks about how identity is situational and
Mm-hmm.
relational.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's funny because here I was thinking, oh, all these Central American countries get along, and
No.
what's the deal with the Mexican?
Mm-hmm.
Back then, we didn't have the term hegemony, which a lot of folks are using, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a lot of it has just to do with conflict because you come
Mm-hmm.
into contact and we're fighting over resources, right?
Yep.
But you're right in terms of also those cultural miscommunications where
Mm-hmm.
you say a certain word and that word resonates differently to somebody
Mm-hmm.
because they're not used to hearing it and they get
Mm-hmm.
offended and it's
And
it's still happening to this day.
mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's, I feel like it's something that, as you come in here, that's something that you're not prepared to, like you're coming here and then I said like te vas a dar en la pared, because you don't like how, in my case, like how I was supposed to communicate, like if for me that's the word that I use. And yeah, people will call it, oh yeah, like the what's it called, the quote unquote like formal Spanish, like I know like Honduran Spanish is not formal, like we have those colloquial palabras coloquiales, and that's happened to every country. And then, but then you come to this. You said you had a Spanish in high school, and I had it too. And then you come to this class, and it's like, okay, that's not how it meant for me. And it's like it's a whole back and forward. So I think that language, of course, plays a a huge role. And then right now that you said about like the el conflicto, yeah, I'm sorry,
Mhm.
between like Mexicans and Salvadoran. I remember like coming here, people used to tell me like, oh yeah, like it was a huge thing between Mexicans and Salvadorans. And then you tell me it was actually between Chapines, and like people actually thinking that it was between Chapines and and Salvadorans. And then in my head, like when I was growing up over there was always a huge thing of, within the Central American countries, um, it was especially between Honduras or Costa Rica, or Honduras and El Salvador. And with Costa Rica, I never understood it. That's another story. I never understood why. But one of the things that, and then, like I said, it can be conflict, can be from different reasons, but I don't know if you have come across from in Honduras, El Salvador, that was actually, they call it like La Guerra del Fútbol. So it's
Mhm.
only lasted 100 hours. And
Mhm.
it was just, like it happened from a soccer, and then it went to like territorial thing. And it's like, for me, like I always, like in my head, I was like, well, Honduras have never had a civil war, like that's not something that happened. Yeah, we suffer from a lot of corruption and a lot of other conflict, but we had never had one like, like the other countries. So when I found out about that one, I was like, so for what it was at the time, like it ends back to like, oh, soccer, and then I went to territorial thing, and then like it was always like a fight between having access to the Atlantic Ocean, you know
Yep.
and like when you come to realize that is about like whole little things, like people will actually tell you that it's like because of soccer, but then other people are going to tell you, oh no, it's because of actually like territory. And these are things that we don't know until we understand history. And like when we come to migration and then we come to these places where it's so diverse, all these little things add up. And it's not that we have like a huge, like fight over like who's better or no. It's because at one point, when as a Central American, you come to the spaces where the majority of Latinx identity is centered on the Mexican culture, and that's amazing, of for representation. Within that same umbrella, we don't try, because that does not represent half, like most of us that identify as Central America. We want to have what's it called, the same representation. And I feel like that's when people who think that Latinx is like its whole, just one group, is where it gets misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, I think, poetry, art,
Mm-hmm.
culture, and a lot of the cultural work that we do is about
Mm-hmm.
genuinely being seen and being heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we were doing this when I went to college almost 30 years ago, where
Mm-hmm.
it was like, people would tell us, you can be Chicano or you can be Chicana if you want to be. And we were like, no,
Mm-hmm.
we appreciate it. We have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
respect for the work you've done, but we don't identify that way. That wasn't our
Mm-hmm.
experience. It was a totally different experience. And I think one of the things that I've talked about in conferences has to do with how, so the civil rights movement
Mm-hmm.
basically had what, once again, quoting George Lipsitz, refers to as ethnogenesis. So you had the
Mm-hmm.
Black Power movement, you had the American Indian movement, you had the Asian American movement, which created this pan ethnic label around like Asian
Mm-hmm.
American or Asian American Pacific Islander. But Central Americans weren't here in such big numbers in the 60s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we
Mm-hmm.
didn't go through our own kind of like movement of
Okay.
creating an identity. Like Chicano,
Mhm.
Chicana came out of the 60s when Mexican Americans
Mhm.
decided they want to reclaim that, right? Um, so there's that in terms of like
Mhm.
our experiences. And now it's been about like how do we create spaces so that people see us within this whole umbrella term of Latinidad,
Yeah.
which means different things in different spaces, right? So for
Yeah.
example, in
Mhm.
LA, which has a heavy Mexican and Chicano population, and influence, it's very different. If you go to San
Mhm.
Francisco, which is also, has had a history,
Mhm.
they had a lot more Nicaraguenses from a
Oh yeah.
long time ago, right?
Mhm.
And then if you go to Houston, despite the fact that it's in the Southwest and it's Tejas, their identity, if we want to call it Latinx or
Mhm.
Latino or Latina, is different than our identity here. And when
Yeah.
you go to Chicago, when you go to New York, you're going to have a lot
Mhm.
more of the Boricua Caribbean experience. Um, so a lot of times our identity ends up being worked out in relation to them, right? It's like,
Mhm.
what does it mean to be Central American in LA? My
Mhm. Oh yeah.
former, my friend who passed away, unfortunately, Horacio Roque Ramirez, who was a professor in Santa Barbara, used to talk about how,
Mhm.
you know, you come to Mexican LA. You don't come to LA, you
Mhm.
come to Mexican LA, and you have to negotiate that, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's what you're describing. And I've always been really curious to see what the difference is. Like if you say the word tamal here, the first thing
Mhm.
that a lot of people will associate is Mexican tamales, right? But if you
Yeah.
say tamal
Mhm.
in Washington, D.C., the first thing they might
Mhm.
associate is tamales salvadoreños because the
Yeah.
majority of the Latinos over there are Salvadoran. Um,
Mhm.
and so it's fascinating to me to see how we navigate that because
Mhm.
ultimately, for me, it's also looking at, well, how do we build political power, both for
Mhm.
our communities
Mhm.
as Central Americans and within bigger groups.
Mhm.
That's I think the reason why you have pan ethnic labels, and they're not perfect,
Mhm.
but it's
Yeah.
like a search for representation to really
Mhm.
feel seen and heard. And then how does that translate into actually having influence and power within a country that really doesn't know how to deal with us?
Yeah. 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 And I think that you're completely right on it because it's like, yeah, yeah, we have all this labels, but they're not completely perfect. And it's true why you said like, about the different identities within, like we talk about, here in the United States, within the cities that have like percentage of, Latinos, and how based on those percentages, depending of the nationality, what their culture there is different. Like it has been, I think, couple of guests that I had in this podcast, and then they have told me about the experience of Washington D.C. That's something I didn't know that. I didn't know there was a huge population of like Central Americans over there. I have been to Miami, so I know like there's a lot of like mixer over there from the Caribbean, from like Central Americans and like other South Americans. And then we go to Chicago is another place, and then San Francisco, which was for me was very surprising to see like a lot of Nicaraguenses and Guatemalans over there, and then you come here, and it's like I tend to say that like identity, it gets formed of course for where you live around, because once you move to these spaces where let's for example here in LA, where the majority of Latinos are Mexicans, you're gonna come to a place and yeah, you may not feel like you fit just because that's not that identity you have been living for like the years that you live back in your country, but you become to adapt yourself, and part of that identity became yours because like and for me, like now it's normal to go outside and like el elotero and los tacos and the food. Like I feel as I don't know, like as normal as it was back home. Seeing a baleada stand in
Mhm.
la esquina. For me to see a taco or like eating tacos or like what taco means, right? Because like
Mhm.
I tried my first Mexican taco here, and what tacos is in Honduras son taquitos fritos, no
Yeah.
what is tortilla con carne, So like,
Mhm.
as well as how the music that you listen, the people you meet, the way you interact with others becomes part of you. But at the same time, like you having that other side of your, I mean, not saying the other side, but those identities of Central American to other nationality became like one, and that's what defines the personal identity, which is like the individual you.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of the fact that we develop our identity based on our surroundings and
Mm-hmm.
our experiences and who we interact with all the time, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
my father, when he was alive, my father was a truck driver, as I was
Mm-hmm.
mentioning to you in the port, and there are a lot of Central American
Mm-hmm.
truck drivers who came in the
Mm-hmm.
80s. And I remember one time I was driving and I asked him, like, por donde le doy? Like, which way should I
Mm-hmm.
go? And he would say, dele derecho, which is the way that Mexicans would
Mm-hmm.
say it. And I
Yeah.
said to him, quiere decir recto? And he was like, es que se le pega uno, like he acknowledged. And he hung out with Mexican
Yeah.
folks. And my son is mixed. My son is
Mm-hmm.
Guatemalan and Mexican or Chicano. I don't know what the heck he's going to
Mm-hmm.
end up calling himself at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the other thing, that we had a lot of intermarriage. And
Mm-hmm.
the I think that the generation where we came, we really resisted a lot of the um, type of almost assimilation into Mexican culture. My friend Orlando, who's from El Salvador, has a poem
Mm-hmm.
where he says, that his mom, who was married to a Mexican man by the time that he got
Mm-hmm.
here, said to him, "Oh, no se dice volado," when you're talking about an item, right? In El Salvador, they'll say,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, pasame el volado," just say like,
Mm-hmm.
"That's give me that thing," right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in his poem, he talks about like, "Oh, no se dice volado, se dice cosa," like how you're
Mm-hmm.
kind of learning the way that people
Mm-hmm.
speak. But I actually have another poem that talks about how I've also influenced people. It's not one
Mm-hmm.
way.
Yeah.
So you'll have people saying puchica who are not Guatemalan because
Mm-hmm.
they've hung out with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's to me it's really interesting and dynamic to see how
Mm-hmm.
we're creating these human connections that are actually creating bonds between communities. and
Mm-hmm.
and I think that ultimately that's kind of how we can start to deal with these conflicts
Mm-hmm.
and really look at how we can still maintain our individual and community differences, but at the same time look at how we can build some bridges
Yeah.
towards improving our communities.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think that you tied it down so well for the next question that I have for you. And this is actually the work that you do for, Ideal Bridges. So your work and art actually just focus mostly on diversity, inclusion, and equity and accessibility to leadership. But how important it is for businesses to be able to grow in those areas? I know, I mean, we understand like it's very important, but like if you can give us like a breakdown, how important it is for businesses to actually look to those specific areas in order for like to grow.
So it's really interesting because I've been doing. I have a master's in comparative ethnic studies from UC Berkeley, and I got
Mm-hmm.
into doing this kind of work through the government, the
Mm-hmm.
county government in LA, and I've been working with organizations and schools to build up diversity and inclusion. Right.
Mm-hmm.
This has been going on for over 15 years, and now after Black Lives Matter, everybody's talking about diversity and inclusion. Right. After
Mm-hmm.
all these people came out and said, what you all are doing as individuals and as organizations is not right.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, black people are getting killed because
Mm-hmm.
of the color of their skin. So I'm glad that we have that now. I'm really
Mm-hmm.
glad that, and I wish that George Floyd and all these other people didn't have to die for that to happen. But
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
we are there now, um, and and a lot of times when we hear people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they talk about it in terms of like the business case. And yeah,
Mhm.
actually, when you have diverse groups and teams, you
Mhm.
tend to have better solutions. When you
Mhm.
have diverse teams and organizations, you tend to have better sales, right? If you
Mhm.
want to look at it from a capitalistic model of like you
Mhm.
make more money if you have diverse teams and sell to a
Yeah.
diverse audience. But there's
Mhm.
also like the question of justice, right?
Mhm.
And going back to the whole notion of representation, feeling seen, feeling heard. And I think
Mhm.
that that's what's really also important because um, that's, in my opinion, what's happening in terms of the folks who are out there on the streets who are fighting and not physically fighting,
Mhm.
but struggling for
Mhm.
recognition, for people not to get killed, for looking the way they do, or for
Mhm.
loving whomever they love, right? I think that that's where it's beneficial for every part of our world to have
Mhm.
a focus on inclusion and diversity. Um, I think that people talk about diversity, and I happen to think that it's a positive thing,
Mhm.
but it's not enough. It's not enough to just have diversity. We have to feel
Mhm.
included in order for us to participate fully in whatever organizations we're from,
Mhm.
whatever communities we're in, whether it be our job or it be our school or somewhere
Mhm.
else. And that's the work that I've been doing since I was a teenager around Central Americans to really
Mhm.
feel like we're included and that we're seen and that we're heard throughout college. And
Mhm.
now, I do that with organizations both um, internally and externally. Not only
Mhm.
about Central Americans, but I do think that it's important for people to understand Central American experiences. I think that our,
Mhm.
our experiences are diverse in and of
Oh
themselves.
yeah.
Our isthmus
Mhm.
is diverse.
Mhm.
Black Central Americans are going to have a different experience than,
Mhm.
Latino, what we call Latino in Guatemala, or mestizo,
Mhm.
or whatever you want to call it, right? Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think that there's plenty of work to be done both within our communities and outside of our communities
Mhm.
to improve our conditions, to improve, the conditions of the
Mhm.
poor and those of us who have been marginalized.
Yeah, yeah, and I totally agree with you, and I think that is very important. I mean, like you said, if you see it from a point of capitalism and seeing like from a business for sales and all of that, I feel like inclusion and diversity is, of course, is a huge thing for me when it comes to inclusion and diversity. Like I truly think like, of course, that's the way we should push for future generation. Yeah, like you said, people shouldn't be dying for us to have that. Like we shouldn't be even having that question, right? Of people dying for communities to have inclusion, diversity within, a workspace or media or any type of actually representation. But for me, I feel like you said it's true that we're moving towards that thing, but sometimes I personally feel that from some companies, and I'm not saying all of them, because I do know that some companies are actually doing it for actually putting representation, inclusion towards justice, but some of them are just an image.
Mhm.
And when you're using a community and others as just an image but not your actual work for other community, that's when I'm like, like that's not the type of representation and inclusion we're actually asking.
Yeah, and some people call it performative. That it's a
Mm-hmm.
performance. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think it's true that you have a lot of organizations, companies that are
Mm-hmm.
jumping on the bandwagon because they want to look good and they don't want to lose
Mm-hmm.
customers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, let's look at, for example, if you have a company that is all about diversity in the United States but ends up exploiting kids in the third world, the
Mm-hmm.
so-called third world, to
Yeah.
make their stuff, then
Mm-hmm.
are we really talking about equity? Or is it
Yeah.
just performative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's one of the big differences that we have. There are also people who are talking about what is referred to as JEDI, JEDI, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Um,
Mm-hmm.
And you know, for me, I ended up creating the acronym ideal because I think that that's what we work towards, right? We're
Mhm.
working towards an ideal. We're working towards something that we want to see happen. Maybe not
Mhm.
in our lifetime, but you know, somewhere down the line, and
Mhm.
we continue to work
Mhm.
towards it, right? But I totally agree with you that it's really important to do the research and to
Mhm.
not get, you know, swept up by a company's performative diversity stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I think that the other day I saw a meme or something, a post that said, you know, why did you decide to do your logo in a rainbow flag, right?
Mhm.
Referring to the LGBTQ community, LGBTQ
Mhm.
plus,
Mhm.
and you know, underneath it said money, and that
Mhm.
is a really interesting critique of
Mhm.
diversity for performance. You know,
Yeah.
diversity just to look good, to keep, you know, your
Mhm.
customers, to keep your sales up.
Mhm.
I happen to think that that kind of work is not really helping communities out. It's just, you know,
Mhm.
pivoting to try to stay with the trends. And for those
Yeah.
of us who've been doing this work for decades now, the important thing is about seeing communities thrive and seeing
Mhm.
communities really feel seen, really feel heard, and really improving what the community conditions are.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so true. And it's sad sometimes when you see companies, and people do it for that. Because it's like, okay, like people have the struggle. I mean, each community has their own struggles, and they're different. And of course, even like you said, even us within the Latinx community, it's like the Central Americans one experience, the South Americans another experience, the Afro Latina one experience, the Indigenous, like I one experience, because like I mean I cannot just put, like, for example, in my case, like as a mestiza, put the same experience as someone who's indigenous. The whole struggle is completely different. And when it's put on the distance of like I'm helping others, it's like in it to social media. I think that's the fact more. I think it's social media more about the work that they do, of how it's portrayed as we're doing the work, rather than I'm just putting it for you to see them. I care, but I actually don't care. And it's true what you said about those especially companies. And it's very important, I think, to figure out, like, to actually focus. For example, and I'm just gonna give you an example. It's like the community who, like, in at one point, it's very hard, to be honest. It's very hard to have, oh, be putting, el dedo at companies or other businesses for it. But is, for example, let's say, like, for bananas, like, and this is something I had told, like, my family. I think I have, oh my god, like over 5 years of not eating chiquita banana or del monte. And I I know people might think that is crazy, but for me, it's like, I know the damages that has caused in my country, and in Central America. And yeah, when you see it from a capitalistic point, it's like, well, it's giving them work in the region. But on my head, I'm like, but what type of work? Because at one point they're being exploited, and they're being, like, put all these chemicals that they have to use for the bananas, and the men I have to, no pueden producir, later have kids, or things like that. So for me it's like I cannot support a company like that. The same time goes with coffee. Like, a lot of us who consume a lot of coffee don't look at us that there's a lot of
Hmm.
child labor, I think, in Central America when it comes to that. And I'm 100%, I think, also in Colombia, which is, where most of the coffee gets imported here to the United States. So having those research of what is, like, hashtag organic, or what is, like, if it's into that CAFTA or like NAFTA or all that thing, I think is a matter of us doing the research. Because if we want to, ¿cómo se llama? If we want to push, like you said, we might not see in our lifetime. Whatever work we do might not. we're not gonna see it right now, but hopefully for future generation, it can be more easy to push for what we want to be, and like you said, ideal, because not everything can be perfect, sadly. But it's like if we don't take our time to research and see like what we're consuming and what we're pushing for us or what we're buying is where that amount of, let's say for example, money, and we're talking a very capitalistic point, money goes, company is going to see, oh well, it brings money, so like it's okay to do it. In
Hmm.
reality, it's not okay to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, boycotts have
Mm-hmm.
been used for a long time in order to bring
Mm-hmm.
attention and try to get companies to change their behavior,
Mm-hmm.
their values, and well, some of the ways that they
Mm-hmm.
work with people. And I admire a lot of the work that I know Susan Garcia is doing some work around Chiquita.
Yeah.
Suyapa Portillo just came out with a book recently about the resistance in
Mm-hmm.
Honduras, and she's done a lot of work around the bananeras, right, which have a
Mm-hmm.
long history in Central America and other
Mm-hmm.
places. And ultimately, I think it's a matter of kind of how we want to live our lives, right, and
Yeah.
what values we have, and why do we do what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I don't shop at Chick-fil-A. I don't buy food
Oh
there
yeah.
because they're anti-LGBTQ.
Mm-hmm.
And my son is watching me, right? My
Mm-hmm.
son sees the fact that I don't do that, and
Mm-hmm.
then he actually understands why, and then he's going to have to make
Mm-hmm.
a choice about whether he wants to buy that or not. So
Mm-hmm.
so it's in multiple ways. I totally agree with you that we need to research where we're
Mm-hmm.
getting stuff. If we can go fair trade, that's great, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And ultimately, we're not going to be perfect. You can't get
Mm-hmm.
everything the way that
Perfect.
we might want
Mm-hmm.
to, but it is making an impact if we're choosing
Mm-hmm.
one company that has better business practices over others, right? And
Mm-hmm.
people know that, and the companies know that.
Yeah.
Um, so that's, and it hits them where it hurts. It's the money, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what they
Yeah.
care about. But I
Yeah.
think for us, it's about values and about the way we want to live our lives. And because, as you
Mm-hmm.
were saying, there's a history behind why,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Central Americans are here in the first place, right? The
Yeah.
migrations were impacted by the coup in
Mm-hmm.
Guatemala in 54, U.S.
Mm-hmm.
intervention in Central America in the 70s, 80s,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the Bananera had a lot to do with that.
Oh yeah,
It's
a
like
lot.
connecting the dots
Mm-hmm.
is what a lot of folks don't know, and that's why I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciate a lot of the work that your generation is doing around that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you all are using social media to educate people and to bring
Mm-hmm.
this history to light, and that's something that we tried to do when we didn't have social media, and I think we were
Mm-hmm.
somewhat successful. But you all are taking it to a whole other level, so thank you.
No, thank you. And I think that work like the you and other people have done throughout decades, you said maybe it wasn't social media there. That's what has inspired, I'll say, my generation, others to continue the work and to continue pushing for that. And for, in the case of Central Americans, I feel like at one point we felt like everything was just based on what that connotation of bad, like everything had a bad meaning of being Central American, and we just wanted to shift it and see like, well, yeah, we have those issues, but we want to educate you why, and why is this resistant, and why we doing this type of work, and why it's important for you to understand this, why we're taking this type of decision into our life. Because if it didn't affect me personally, it affected my parents or my grandparents or my tatarabuelos, like, and everything is going to come into a change. And sadly, like you said, it's a lot of interventions, a lot of, like if we talk, like about la bananeras and like fruit company, it's a lot of issues that when it comes in Guatemala, and of course in the whole Central America. But I think that the work that the fruit company did in Guatemala, or I feel like until this day, you cannot, what's it called, you cannot sanar, what they did, or just by a post. And I'm so happy that you bring Susana Garcia. I love Susie, and it's something that I think she pushed so much of like, yeah, maybe it's in history, and this company might put it as it already passed, we already forgot it, and like if we make a change, but no, the change that you made in a company is not the change that you made into our communities. And there are people, whole communities died, whole communities lost their land for it. And is us not letting these companies who just went into our lands and do whatever they wanted to do for monetary, things that they wanted to get, is for us to say like, we don't want you to forget that we are the sons and daughters of those who struggled back in the day, and we don't want you to forget what you did.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to be
Hmm.
naive and say that everything would
Hmm.
be perfect had that
No.
intervention not happened. But at
Hmm.
the same time, would we have had as many people killed in the Civil War if,
Hmm.
the arms funding and support wasn't there?
Hmm.
Um, if, you know, Ottomans wouldn't have been overthrown because the United
Hmm.
States had, one of the Dulles brothers as
Hmm.
one of the high cabinet members, and then his
Hmm.
other brother was a board member in Chiquita Banana, United Fruit Company, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I wonder, and I know that a lot of folks came here directly because of the war. A lot
Oh
of
yeah.
people came
Hmm.
because they were literally fleeing for their lives.
Hmm.
Um, but I wonder, and the privilege that I have as a
Hmm.
Ladino who, was poor in Guatemala. We didn't have a lot. We didn't have any land or anything. Um, but I wonder what would it have been like if my parents would have had a good job and not had to have moved, right? What would have
Hmm.
happened in terms of my family system, my
Hmm.
cousins and aunts? I'll share something with you that's very personal. But my father was an alcoholic, and he had stopped drinking before he came to the United States. He had already stopped drinking for months. It had been a long time, and then he came to the U.S. and he was drinking when my mother got here a few months after he came.
Hmm.
And he was chased by immigration. He had to hide inside a trash can. He was
Hmm.
separated from his family. I mean, despite the
Hmm.
fact that he, was an alcoholic, I knew that my father loved me. He may not have known
Hmm.
how to love me, but he loved me.
Hmm.
And I think that the trauma of leaving your kids behind and everything that he went through contributed to
Hmm.
him drinking again.
Hmm.
So on the personal level, I wonder, what if my dad would
Hmm.
have had a good job and we would have been able to live in Guatemala so we didn't need to migrate? What would have happened,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And we'll never know.
We'll
But,
never know.
for people who have had to leave their country, there's always that question, right? I'm
Hmm.
always looking at my cousins' lives, my cousins who are the same age, and I think about like, what my life had been like theirs. Some of them have been successful, and some of them haven't, right? And
Hmm.
it really does pique my curiosity to think about, well, what would have happened if I wouldn't have come here? And I'm
Hmm.
grateful for everything that my parents did, all the sacrifices that they did. But I am really curious, and we'll never know the answer. But
Hmm.
the forces that forced us to move
Hmm.
and forced so many people to leave um, were not invisible. they were
Hmm.
they were literally economic and military
Hmm.
interventions that
Hmm.
forced our countries to go through some of the darkest periods in their history.
Yep.
And the other thing I want to mention is resilience, right?
Hmm.
From Central American women and men, indigenous people, black people are so resilient. That's one of the things that I also have learned and that I think we have to
Hmm.
highlight as well.
Yeah.
We're not victims. We're not,
Hmm.
we may have been targeted. We may have been obviously hurt and not had the best situation, but we have
Hmm.
contributed a lot to this country, to the local communities, to the United States,
Hmm.
to our communities back home because we're
Yeah.
helping to prop up entire,
Mhm.
economies over there.
Yeah.
And that's one of the
Mhm.
things that I think is really important for us is to remember the resilience that people have
Mhm.
shown, whether we had a civil war or not. Like
Mhm.
Honduras had its own issues in terms of
Mhm.
military occupation because the
Yeah.
United States was basically using it as a base. You know,
Well, yeah, and
um,
it still is till
yeah,
this
yeah,
day. Yeah, and it's true, and I'm very like to remember that. I think is good for us because so like you said, sometimes we just focus of like, oh, we went through this and this and that, but like how we come up from those instances is like what we need to highlight. And I really appreciate you focusing and even wondering. I think la curiosidad es siempre buena, because as if you had been curious of what would have happened, I had those senses, que me hubiera pasado si me hubiera quedado en Honduras, uh, I came here because of the divorce of my parents, but if you add something else, it's because my mom lost almost all her job after el golpe de estado. And that's, it wasn't a civil war, but for me it was the closest to be compared. And to be have fear if you don't know what was going to happen. So yeah, I'm just very thankful for your conversation, and then to hear your experience of migration, and always tying it to how diverse identity and inclusive, and how the struggles in this case of Central America have brought us to come to here, for you to start the job that you do, and sorry, the work that you do, to push for diversity, to push for inclusion, and for seeing others generation, like the generation now are taking it to like the to social media, and be like, okay, we're going to continue the same work that you and the scholars have been doing through years, but now we're just going to make it more in the social media era, just because I feel like that's, and personally me, that's where I learned the most. I learned for so many people that share their stories and share their point of views on social media. And I think that social media have brought a huge platform for not only history, but at the same time for education and news, because without social media we wouldn't have like as quick as the news that we have from back home and other places.
yeah. I totally agree with that. And actually, I was an academic. I mean, I actually
Mm-hmm.
teach community college, and I was on track to become a PhD, and
Mm-hmm.
was looking at going into the academic track. And I have a lot of respect for my friends who are academics. I mean, Ana Patricia Rodriguez was one of my graduate
Mm-hmm.
student instructors when I was an undergrad. Lacey Abrego, you know, Oriel Maria Siu, Mario Escobar. Like, there's such
Mm-hmm.
a plethora now of
Mm-hmm.
professors and academics who are actually fighting within academia, because that's also a
Mm-hmm.
battlefront
Yeah.
that people are really having to go through. Arturo Arias kind of led the way for a lot of us as Guatemalans and Central Americans as well. Um, and I think that the work that they're doing is really incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do we bridge that? How do we create the connection with the folks who aren't in academia, right? And how do we
Mm-hmm.
create the connection between that and organizations? How
Yeah.
do we bring the information that is being brought out, the research, the brilliant stuff, and how do we actually get it out to the masses, to the people
Mm-hmm.
who may not be at the universities, so that they can learn?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's one of the things that you all are doing really well around social media and the education that's happening. It's fascinating for me to see TikTok videos about like mental health,
Mm-hmm.
or
Oh yeah.
imperialism, or all
Mm-hmm.
these things that we
Mm-hmm.
used to go to college for and take classes about, right? And it's like
Mm-hmm.
you're taking like a little mini course. So in
Yeah.
that sense, it's great. The one thing that I do want to kind of explore a little bit more is the whole concept of migration. And
Mm-hmm.
my friend who's a Chi and produces the show Contacto Ancestral for KPFK here in LA, likes to talk about that we don't migrate. Not everybody migrates. A lot of us are displaced.
Oh yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a very important distinction, because yeah, when you think about, and I'm really glad that the work around the language of migration has happened. So going from immigrant to migrant is
Mhm.
key because our peoples used to go up and down from south to
Mhm.
north and north to south
Yeah.
before there were even all these borders, right? So
Yeah.
so that migration is important to talk about, and you know it's also important to talk about the forces that expel people from their home countries or their home communities
Mhm.
and that displace them, right? And so that's
Mhm.
one of the things that I'm really also looking at, and keeping in mind that he uses the language of displacement because I
Mhm.
think that for us, that's something that we have to also continue to talk about, that we don't come
Mhm.
here for vacation, that we
No.
don't come here out of necessity, that we come here out of necessity, not out
Mhm.
of, a whim because we want to go somewhere else. I mean, some people
Yeah.
do, but in mass, and the majority of us come here out of
Mhm.
necessity, come here looking
Out
for
of necessity.
jobs, come here seeking asylum, seeking
Mhm.
refuge, because, things that have happened in our home countries have basically forced us to leave or expelled us.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I mean the work that's being done around trans migrants from Honduras is incredible,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
the resilience that those folks are showing is also incredible. So that's one of
Yeah.
the things that I also like to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, and definitely. And I feel like it's true how we should continue having this type of conversation about migration, about identity, about all this type of, and looking very close about the language we use. How we were at the beginning saying, like, like how we get confused sometimes when we migrate here, and like we get, yeah, the words that we use in another country are different. At the same time, while we're trying to explain and like educate others and have these issues out there, focus on the language, because it's true, like, I was, like my family was, decided to migrate for, better life, or, I mean, everybody is looking for the same thing, but there's some who are like forcibly being like displaced from the land. And it's like, it's the same action of moving, but it's the meaning is different, because maybe I had a privilege the other person didn't, and I think that also highlighting how privilege comes into place within migration, because within our communities we sometimes take aside the racism that is within our communities.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that one of the things that I would also argue is that when it comes to gender, a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
women leave because of the misogyny, sexism that exists, right? So, I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
were describing that you left because your mother didn't have any job opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a feeling that her gender had a lot to do with that. I have
Yeah.
a feeling that if your mother would have had job opportunities, she might have thought twice about whether she wanted to come here or not,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I I appreciate the fact that you're acknowledging privilege, and at the same time, I think it's important for us to look at how we're not only displaced or expelled by
Mm-hmm.
military forces, we're also displaced and expelled by economic forces.
Yeah.
And, sexism and
Mm-hmm.
racism and homophobia and
Mm-hmm.
transphobia and all these
Yeah.
other things that, unfortunately, our communities and our countries are also dealing with.
Yep, definitely. And I feel like I can talk so much with you. It was such a good conversation, but I really appreciate your time. I feel like if again you can come here in the show, we can have a more extended conversation, because I really appreciate all this point of view that you have shared from the beginning. From your poem, the all the explanation of identity, diversity, how migration, and how coming to like the conversation until the work that you do and the work that many others are doing. I really appreciate that. Do you want to share anything before we close? Do you want to share a poem?
Yeah, so I'll
Oh
share
yeah.
a couple things.
Mhm.
Last year during the lockdown, if we want to call it that,
Mhm.
or when we were, at home,
Mhm.
I started doing these virtual poetry readings, and
Oh.
we started calling it the poetic pandemic. So we
Mm.
literally would do virtual readings, and the idea for me came out of a reading that I'm going to do in September, which is I've always wanted to
Okay.
do a reading with Guatemaltecos and Guatemaltecas from the margins with people raised here. And so on September
Mm.
11th, we're going to do that reading with people from
Oh,
Guate
okay.
and people from here. Um,
Mhm.
and that project is currently being developed with a committee, mostly women, but
Mhm.
I'm involved with it as well from both Guate and the United States. And so as a result of these readings, we've done multi-ethnic readings. We've done readings with Central Americans raised in the United States or living in the United States in Spanish. We actually ended up starting an Instagram called Flowidarity, like flow and solidarity combined.
Mhm.
So that's where you can find a lot of the work that we've been doing in terms of poetry readings that have to do with solidarity
Mhm.
and really standing up for each other. Um, it's in my YouTube channel. Some of that stuff, both my
Mhm.
poetry and some of the poetry events that we put on
Mhm.
are in my YouTube channel, which is under G as in Gustavo, and then Maing as in
Mhm.
MEING.
Mhm.
And I actually just created a bit.ly that says VozTube, like YouTube, but
Mhm.
Voz.
Mhm.
So people can find it there. And on June 26th, yes, June 26th, Saturday, June 26th, from 5 to 7, we're going to do one that is going to be called Flowidarity with the Displaced. So we're
Mm. Mhm.
assembling a group of different people who are immigrants, end
Mhm.
quotes, from different ethnicities in different parts of the world. And we're going to talk about like what does it mean to be displaced or to be a
Mm.
migrant or to be an immigrant through
Mhm.
poetry. And so that's
Okay.
going to be from 5 to 7. There's also a Flowidarity page on Facebook, and people can find it using my full name, Gustavo
Mhm.
Adolfo Guerra Vasquez. So that's the one announcement that I want to make. And I actually was thinking about reading another quick poem
Yeah. Go
that
ahead.
has to do with this. And I just wrote it recently, so it's in rough draft, and it has something to do with what we've been talking about. So it says, my ancestors didn't simply migrate; they moved as they needed to. My abuelas went from both ends of the home country to Guatemala City, la capital, the capital, in order to survive, in order to make a better living, one trying to keep her marriage together, even if she had to leave her kids, the other one running from an abusive husband to become a sirvienta, work her chubby fingers to the bone in order to buy some land. They both moved in order to make a home, put a roof over my aunts and uncles' heads. My parents didn't migrate. They were expelled, displaced from my grandmother's homes, looking for a place to call their own, looking for a land where they could live, looking for a home where they could just be. I did not migrate. I was brought to the US, unceded Tongva territory, to be more specific, sent for by my mother via a coyota who specialized in bringing kids from Central America during our own 1982 mini caravans. It's not that I'm ungrateful. I just want to clarify that I was brought at 8 years old, and even though my maternal grandmother asked me not to leave, her past behavior told me that what she really wanted was the dollars that my mother sent to take care of me. Because hurt people. However, healing people is what we should try to be. And that's where I left it.
It's
I haven't
really
finished
nice.
it yet.
Yeah, but it's really nice. Thank you again for sharing. And if you can send me actually the links, I'll put them down below. I'll tag them in the notes for the episode and then the YouTube channel as well. And I want to thank you for taking the time to come to share both poems, and I appreciate the time and the work that you're doing. And I cannot wait to go. Is the event in person, the one for September, or
No,
is
that
it
one's going to
virtual?
be virtual because we're going to have people
Oh,
from
okay.
Guate
Okay.
and people from here. So
Okay. Okay.
so
Okay.
it's going to be virtual. Um,
Okay.
and we'll record it and we'll put it on YouTube. But we're also going to try to do a Facebook Live or
Okay.
YouTube Live. So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
we're shooting
Yeah.
to have 13 poets. with gender balance and LGBTQ representation, different ethnicities out of Guate as well as
Hmm.
here, and
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
looking forward to it, and we might even do another Central American in the U.S. poetry reading the day before if we had the
Okay.
energy to
Oh,
do it. So
okay.
yeah,
That's perfect. Yeah, just send me the information and like the listeners and viewers know that I tag everything downstairs. So like if they want to go follow you, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all the social media, that way they can continue and follow your work. And yeah, just send me the links and I'll link them down below.
thank you
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you for everything.